Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking your time this evening. Up here in Auckland, it's a pretty nice evening. I'm sure that some of you based in Auckland would rather be going for a walk on the beach or something. Really appreciate you, giving us a little bit of time, and thank you so much to Hayden for this opportunity to do this professional development session, and thank you so much for taking the initiative to start this series of talks. I've only participated in one, and it was pretty valuable. So I'm really honoured to get the chance to speak now. I have to say that what Hayden said is right about interpreting being a bit of a lonely profession. It's very fragmented. People tend not to communicate very much between interpreters, which is weird because the vast majority of us are not competitors. You know, I'm a Japanese to English and vice versa interpreters. I cannot compete with somebody doing another language. I only do one language. So we really need to communicate more, and these sessions are a great way to do that, I think. Right, so on with the show. Very briefly, who am I? My name is Glen, as Hayden said, 41. I'm from the wonderful Waikato, but I currently live in Auckland. Go through this really quickly. So I lived up in Japan for a total of 9 years, 5+ years of which was with a rugby-focused company. I was part of that as a full-time team interpreter, translator in-house. And there'll be a little vignette that's part of today's session. I've spent 8 years in counting with a company called Japanese Solutions based here in Auckland. And in 2012, I passed my NAATI professional translator exam. I haven't done the interpreting exam. If anybody is willing to pay the 800 Australian dollars or whatever it is, I'd be happy to hear you talk. But for now, I'm doing all right as it is. And the NZSTI have graciously let me in as an associate interpreter, so we'll go with that. The vast majority of my learning in interpreting sphere is what they call OJT in Japan, on-the-job training, only very basic formal training. Most of my work has been in person, so this Zoom thing, or CX3 was it, is quite new to me too, as I'm sure it is to everybody. Most of my stuff has been face-to-face interpreting in business, sport, fields like that, and not so much your classical interpreting situations like medical or legal. So I think I come at things from a bit of a different angle to a lot of people here. Right. This presentation, it kind of riffs a little bit on a presentation I did at the NZSTI conference 3 years ago, so I kind of hope that this won't be boring for anybody. Very basically, ethical principles and principles of good interpreting practice are really valuable, I believe. They form an important part of how we operate, but the real world sometimes gets in the way. And so what I'd like to do today is just sort of explore 3 points from my experiences, which sort of call into question some of the principles we work based on and challenge us as to how we can act in an ethical and principled way. And I appreciate that, a lot of the participants here tonight have probably had an enormous wide range of experiences. And actually, at the end, I'd be really happy to hear some of your, obviously, questions, but also experiences as well. Okay. So basically, 3 quick case studies I'd like to run through. What sort of ethical principles might have applied? What did the real world commercial situation demand? How did I solve or not solve the situation? And what are the takeaways? What can we learn about moving forward? And particularly about how to bridge the gap between the expectations of what we do and what people who pay our bills do. Rightio. Okay, so the first situation was when I was based in Japan. So I was the in-house interpreter for a company rugby team. First thing was, it was a service company. They didn't create a physical product. They sold a service, so they're very, very big about the image and everything. And a rugby team was part of the company promotion, essentially. The team, when I was first hired, they'd also just hired 2 New Zealand coaches. The head coach is a very passionate, dynamic guy who tended to speak his mind. The vast majority of the players were Japanese. That's where I came in. And one particular situation was very challenging. We were in a provincial area. It was quite a small city, large town area. We were staying in a very average hotel. It might have been nice once, but it had run down a lot. We'd played all right, but we'd been beaten by a stronger opponent. And the team, everyone was really downcast. The coaches had obviously hoped to have won. The players were upset. They travelled a long way for nothing, basically. And so after the game, there was a brief get-together at the stadium. And unbeknown to some people, some of the hotel staff had actually come along just to say thank you to everyone who'd watched the game. They wanted to say thank you. And the coach stood up in front of the players and everyone said, among other things, as part of his speech, he said, looking to the next game, let's regroup, train hard, and play well so that we can stay in a nice hotel on our next away trip. So what do you do in a situation where you have people who work for that hotel, which the coach is clearly insulting? His message is directed at the players. He doesn't care about the hotel staff in the room together. What do you do? Because the reality is, as an in-house interpreter, translator, you have multiple responsibilities. You're not only an interpreter actually in that situation, but you're also a member of the staff. So you have a responsibility to project a good image for the team and the company. What did I do? I played it by the book. I provided an accurate interpretation. Unfortunately, on the bus, it was a very long bus ride back to Tokyo later. I got totally chewed out by the team management for basically insulting the hotel staff, hotel management, and therefore damaging the team and company image. I was told that this sort of thing should not happen, and my job was essentially to keep the foreign coaches and players in line so they didn't cause any trouble. I pushed back. I took the classic interpreting ethics line. I said, no, that's not my role. If he wants to shoot his mouth off, I just convey the message. And there were words, there were arguments, but eventually people came around to my point of view. What could I have done better? What can we learn from that? I guess the first point is that as soon as you get to the point where the coach is, once you're actually in that situation interpreting for him, it's a pure interpreting situation. You can't really change what he says, because the moment you do that, it's a very, very slippery slope. So my learning from that was essentially to educate the guy, to make him understand when he could shoot his mouth off and when he couldn't, to be more situationally aware, which thankfully is something rugby coaches are always banging on about. So he got that. So I tried to get him to say, look, if we're in our clubhouse with only our players and staff present, you say what you like. When we're out in public, you must not. But I also tried to work on the team management about my situational role to get them to understand that when I'm interpreting, I'm doing it as an interpreter, not as a member of the management staff. And this was really difficult because their previous interpreters had not done that. Their previous interpreters had changed the message where need be, which I refused to do. And the takeaway for me really was that, especially as an in-house interpreter, you have so many stakeholders, so many different clients, so many different people that you have to answer to and all keep happy. In that particular situation, you've obviously got the speaker, the coach, you've got to interpret for him, the audience, the players, the team management who are constantly watching me, especially after that incident, anybody else involved, what broader stakeholders such as the hotel staff, and the company as a whole. Japanese companies in particular, very, very keen to protect their brand image, especially companies with an intangible product. So there's so many clients and stakeholders you have to bear in mind. It's not just a simple interpreting job. So that was one big learning experience for me. All right, moving right along. Okay, we're back in New Zealand now. This is about 5-6 years ago, and we got a booking from a local company here in Auckland who asked for interpreting a Skype conference because they were pitching to a company in Japan. When I turned up at the appointed time, it turned out that in fact they didn't need an interpreter because the manager at the Japan end spoke excellent English. And what the New Zealand company wanted me to do was to sit off on the side where nobody could see me and listen to what the Japanese employees was talking amongst themselves in Japanese to try and get the good stuff out of the conversation. In other words, they wanted me to spy on their potential client in Japan. Not something I expected I'd have to do. So what do you do in this situation? The commercial demand is quite clearly that they've asked me to do a job and they want me to do it, but it's a highly unethical situation, so it would seem, because it's spying. I'm an interpreter, not a spy. Okay, I'm not James Bond or anyone like that. The key ethical dilemma for me was, did the Japanese group have a reasonable expectation of confidentiality? In other words, if they were discussing something amongst themselves, even if they're on a Skype call, should they have expect that conversation would remain confidential? Could I, in other words, use that, should I pull out of the situation? As you can imagine, I was a bit flustered by this. So I just sort of took my time to ask about how the meeting was set up and how it would work. And it turned out that in previous meetings, the other Japanese employees had been clearly audible, just the New Zealanders couldn't understand what they were saying. And the New Zealanders had actually thrown out a few words of Japanese as greetings just to try and lighten the mood and break the ice. And there was a whiteboard behind the camera. They clearly had a nice video conferencing setup at this company in Japan. And so the Japanese text was visible on that. And so I made a reasonable determination that New Zealand client was actually just bigging it up, making a big deal about the fact that I'd be spying on them. And that was reinforced by the fact that this businessman, he was an advertising guy, he was a bit of a big mouth, big noter. So I figured that, okay, I can safely go ahead with this. I don't need to pull out. And I went ahead and did the job. In the end, it was a flop. It was a failure because the Japanese manager was essentially passing on everything anyway. So actually having me in there was a bit of a waste of time, and I didn't get another job out of it. So what can we learn about this? What's the takeaways? I think the first thing was to find as much information as possible from the booking stage, from the brief. If somebody emails, especially a first-time customer, and says, we want an interpreter, don't just say, yeah, sure. Take the time, try and get information. I've learned to always ask for any documentation I can read, any websites I can refer to. Who are we going to be dealing with at the other end? What is your company? Especially in New Zealand, people sometimes just call up and say, I want an interpreter. They don't even give you the company they work for. To get more of that background information, it obviously helps you do a better job by preparing in advance so you're ready for whatever terminology you get. But it also, in the worst case, allows you to work out if the situation may end up being unethical or potentially uncomfortable for you. The situation reminded me that many clients using the interpreter for the first time have no idea, or rather very unrealistic expectations of what an interpreter's role is or what we can do. In other words, they just lack experience of what we can do. They lack experience of how we operate. Most businesses in New Zealand will have experience of working with lawyers, accountants, and other professionals, but interpreters, not so much. So I guess this is a much bigger issue of how us as a profession, we can sort of promote ourselves. But in terms of what's in front of us right now, a little bit more communication at an early stage can really help. Okay, and moving along to their third case. So this was again in Auckland, maybe 2-3 years ago. So a Japanese regional tourism promotion organisation had organised a large event at a hotel in Auckland. There was maybe 15, 20 people coming out from Japan, a lot of local clients here, businessmen, politicians, tourism industry people. This is obviously pre-COVID. It was a really big event. In fact, the company I work for was asked to supply 6 interpreters because a particular key session, there was going to be like a fair, they called it. So there'd be a whole bunch of desks and people from various tourist destinations or tourism-oriented businesses would set up tables where people could, local New Zealand customers or tourism operators could just sort of come and mix and mingle, bring a glass of wine and talk to people about what's great about your hotel, what's great about your castle or your scenic area or whatever. It was a really well set up, well run session. Until the desk that I was assigned to, I was to interpret for the general manager of a major hotel in this area. And I sort of said hello, and we're just about to sit down at the table. All the promotional materials were there, the pamphlets and the poster was on the wall behind us. And a senior politician from his prefecture turned up. And he said, I've got to talk to this guy. So he said, right, you've read our stuff, you know about our area. Can you just talk to the guests, talk to them in English, promote our region, promote my hotel, and when I come back, I'll talk to you again. Which kind of threw me for a loop, because obviously, how can I interpret when there is no client to actually say anything? In other words, is it actually okay when you've been booked as an interpreter to just task shift from an interpreting situation to tourism promotion. How can you resolve these competing obligations? I mean, there were commercial obligations because there were, as I say, a lot of people had come from Japan, senior government officials, businessmen, a lot of New Zealand guests, tourism industry people, some VIPs. Didn't want to let them down, but also didn't want to let down my fellow interpreters at the same event. There were 5 other people in that room now looking at me, going, "What on earth is he doing? Is he? And I knew if I caused a problem there, if I made a scene, that would let them down. So it was a really tricky situation. So firstly, I tried to negotiate, but the hotel manager was adamant. He said, "Nope, the governor is waiting. I got to go." And so I at least tried to clarify, is this actually what you want? You just want me to talk about your hotel? I said, "Look, is there anyone else from your hotel who can talk about this?" I stressed that I really didn't know his region that well. I'd been there once. I liked it. It was a lovely place, but didn't know it that well. And I had about 15 seconds to do all of this. But eventually he said, "Yep, you're good. You're fine. Bye." So essentially I went ahead with it because I didn't know what else I could do. So I just sat there with a smile on my face, made jokes. I said, "Hi, I'm not from such and such a hotel. The gentleman, he's just been away for a moment. He'll be right back. Here's his flyer. But I can tell you about my personal experiences in this area." And I just basically laughed my way through the hour because I thought this hotel manager would come back soon, but he didn't come back for an hour. So the takeaways, what can we learn from a mad situation like this? This sort of request, I think, is highly ethically questionable. I really should have pushed back harder because, I mean, I'm not a tourist promotion guy. I'm not there I don't know enough about his hotel or his area to promote it. And of course, you take a step back as how can you avoid that as much as possible in the first place? At the introduction stage, when you first meet him, work out what the brief is, get as much information as possible, but like the last case. And as a risk hedge, find out who else is in the delegation. In other words, was there somebody else from his hotel? And it turns out there was, but he was off somewhere else. If I'd been able to say, "Hey, what about Mr. Tanaka? Isn't he from your hotel?" Maybe, just maybe, the manager would have said, "Yeah, I'll go and get him for you." It also reminded me that clients often misunderstand what an interpreter is. I mean, it's your conversation. We just facilitate it for you. Yes, you've given me all this stuff, but my job is not to read this inch-thick pile of material and tell people about it. My job is to pass on your conversation. But again, maybe people don't get that. And of course, for somebody else who doesn't know the interpreting profession, what for them is no issue at all is actually for us ethically, morally questionable behavior. But one takeaway from it was that certainly a smile goes a long way. I know that in his introduction to this, Hayden talked about, maybe a human tape recorder or microphone or something like this. In the most difficult of situations, if you have a smile on your face, people will warm to you, and it helped me get through it. And in the end, I think we created quite a positive impression. So that's all about the little vignettes, case studies, if you like. Just a few broad takeaways, and I'm really keen to hear your thoughts about these based on your experiences as well. First and foremost, I think preemptive framing. In other words, get out in front of things. That 30-second briefing before you start is absolutely critical because that's the opportunity the interpreter has to set the boundaries of the job. Especially, the small talk. Have you worked with an interpreter before? As soon as somebody says no, that sets off the alarm in your head. You say, all right, then you give them a full spiel. This is your conversation. I just pass it on. If you say something rude, I pass on something rude. No filter. Just to run through these things to make people start thinking about how the process is actually going to work. A further step before that, gathering as much information as possible. When you take the booking, don't just say, "Yep, for no problem. Yep, 2:00 on Friday. Yep, we'll be there." Who are the parties involved at this end and at the other end? What is the goal of the interaction? Read between the lines. Try and think about what it is they actually want. Background research. What is the topic, especially if it's one you don't know much about? And I get this all the time because I did a lot of commercial work. I've done, real estate, finance, banking, insurance. I thought I was on top of things. A couple of weeks ago, I had a big job about insurance broking software. And insurance and insurance broking are two different beasts altogether. And I had to do a lot of background research to get up to speed on that because the way these companies operate is quite different. You never quite know what you're going to get, so you have to be prepared to keep learning. Think on your feet and be aware of the situation. This refers back to the rugby coach case. If I had looked up and looked out, and before the conversation, the speech started, if I'd noticed the hotel manager there, I might have had the chance to say to the coach, hey, oh, look at that. The hotel manager's come to see us off. Fantastic. Just to plant the seed that might have made him stop to think before he spoke. Or, for example, in the hotel manager case, if I'd noticed, is your offside, Mr. A, is he here? If you can throw someone's name out there, maybe that's enough to grab onto to save the situation. And finally, the more I think about it, ethics are not just about rules on paper. It's not just something that you have to dribble on about to pass your NAATI exam or to get your NAATI recertification. It's not just something that NZSTI says we should do, but they actually help us. And I think the key thing is creating an ethical situation makes us comfortable in our work. It means it avoids uncomfortable situations. They can help us avoid difficulties and therefore help us do our job. And that's what we want to do, isn't it? And so that's it from me. Very keen to hear your thoughts about my few little nuggets and hear from about your experiences. And I guess at this stage I should look to hand it back to Hayden.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, so there are a lot of people through the chat burning to ask you
Oh, wow.
questions. Case study 2, I think that's where I've seen the most comments come through the chat so far around defining your scope and your role.